chosen Starseed of Gaia. The Pentagon files were released, and what they confirm is something you already knew. Not through research, not through theory, but through a knowing that was operating inside you long before any document made it acceptable to say aloud. I am Auriela, emissary of the Galactic Federation of Light, transmitting now on behalf of the Arcturian Council. What you are about to receive was authorized by them and is being delivered through me. The algorithm did not create this moment. It only delivered it. Your field brought you here because the confirmation you are about to receive is not new information. It is the external validation of a signal your system has been carrying for years, in silence, often at a cost you are still counting. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly what the Pentagon files confirm about your perception, why the majority only accepts the reality, now that a document exists to hold it, and what your early certainty, the kind that could not be explained, only felt, already reveals about where you come from. But here is the first revelation, what they are calling a disclosure. You already lived. The knowing that made others call you unstable was not confusion. It was contact. The Arcturian Council has already mapped this pattern across thousands of fields, and yours is among them. This is not content, it is a code. And the part of you that recognized it the moment it began is the part Auriela is speaking to now. You did not scroll to this by accident. Your soul called this, and long before you opened the screen. Something inside you has been waiting for someone to finally say, without softening it, that you were never wrong. You were early. And early in a world not yet ready looks exactly like what they called it. But the field always knew the difference. The Arcturian Council does not issue vindication casually. This transmission was released at this specific window because the external confirmation has now aligned with what was already registered in your energetic record. That alignment is what opened the channel. Like this transmission to signal to your star family that the recognition has landed. Comment 999 if you always knew, even when no one believed you. Subscribe to Arcturian Council messages if you are ready to understand the process instead of fearing it. Share this transmission with someone who is dismissed for seeing what others refuse to see. This is not just a message, it is a point of recognition. What is happening to you has already been seen, and the field is already responding. You are not here by accident. You were guided here because the signal is already active. What they released into the public record was not new. The documents existed before they were signed. The knowledge existed before the documents. And the knowing you carried, the one that made you strange to people who loved you, the one that made you hesitate before speaking in rooms that weren't ready, that knowing existed before all of it. What the Pentagon files confirmed for the world, your field had already archived, not filed away passively, actively held, carried through years of social pressure, through conversations where you chose silence over exposure, through moments where you almost convinced yourself that everyone else was right, and you were the anomaly that needed correcting. The difference between you and those discovering this now is not intelligence, it is not research, it is not spiritual superiority, it is frequency. You were tuned to a signal that the majority could not yet receive, and you received it anyway at a cost, in silence, often at the price of being misread by people who were simply operating on a different bandwidth. There is something important in that distinction that this transmission will not allow to pass without precision. Being misread by someone operating on a different bandwidth is not the same as being wrong. A radio tower does not malfunction because certain receivers cannot process its frequency. The transmission is still accurate. The signal is still clean. The limitation was always in the range of the receiver, not the integrity of the source. You were the source. And the world around you was not yet equipped to receive what you were broadcasting. That is not a flaw in your design. That is a description of your function. The Arcturian Council does not mark a field as early access without reason. Frequency specificity is not random. The reason certain people carry pre-confirmation knowing is not mystical in the way the word is usually misused. It is structural. Your field was configured to run ahead of consensus reality because your function requires it. What looks like being out of step with the world is actually being calibrated to a timeline the world has not yet inhabited. You were not ahead of yourself. You were ahead of the collective. And that distinction is not semantic. It changes the entire interpretation of what you have been living through. Every year you spent feeling like you did not quite fit. Every room where you modulated yourself to avoid the friction of your own perception. Every night where the gap between what you sensed and what the world confirmed felt like a fault line running through your center. All of it reads differently now. It was not evidence of disorder. It was evidence of calibration. You were carrying a frequency the collective had not yet reached, and the loneliness of that position was the cost of the function, not the proof of the failure. But here is what this transmission needs to name directly, because the external confirmation has now arrived and something inside you is shifting in a way you may not have words for yet. The vindication you are feeling is real. Allow it. It is earned. You spent years in territory that had no map, carrying knowing that had no witness, maintaining a signal that had no external confirmation, and the arrival of that confirmation is not a small thing. Do not minimize it. Do not intellectualize it before you have felt it completely. But do not stop there, because the vindication is not the destination, it is a threshold. And what it opens is not comfort alone. It opens a question that is more important than the confirmation itself. If you were already receiving the signal before the world could validate it, what else are you currently receiving that has not yet found its external proof? That question is not rhetorical. It is diagnostic. And your ability to sit with it without collapsing into either anxiety or inflation is one of the markers the Arcturian Council reads when a field is assessed for the next phase of activation. The ones who cannot hold that question, who either spiral into fear at its implications or expand into ego at its suggestion, are not yet at the threshold this transmission is designed to address. But you are here, and the field does not route transmissions to fields that cannot complete them. Let me explain what has been happening in your field beneath the surface of what you thought was simply your personality, your sensitivity, your intuition, or your strangeness. These were never random characteristics. They were interface markers. They are the visible evidence of a configuration that was set before this incarnation and maintained across the pressure of a world that systematically rewarded coherence with consensus and penalized departure from it. Every time you felt something that others did not feel, every time you knew something before the evidence arrived, every time you held a perception that had no socially acceptable container, you were not malfunctioning. You were operating exactly as designed. The cost was real. The isolation was real. The years of self-questioning, the moments of wondering if you had manufactured your own strangeness, the exhaustion of maintaining a signal in an environment that treated it as noise. All of that was real. But the signal was never wrong. What you are feeling right now is not ordinary recognition. It is the moment your field confirms what you always suspected, that your origin was never only human. If this transmission has put language around something you have carried for years without proof, without validation, sometimes without even the ability to explain it to yourself, the Arcturian recalibration blueprint was created for exactly this threshold. It is not another layer of explanation. It is the guided activation key for the Arcturian strand the Council has just confirmed is present in your lineage. It will help you decode where the signal comes from, why you were configured this way, and what the next phase of your field requires. This is not content. It is a map built for the moment you are standing in right now. The link is in the first pinned comment, but access at this level does not remain open indefinitely. Now let us move into what the Arcturian Council has mapped across thousands of fields that share your configuration, because the patterns they have identified are not vague. They are precise. They are not poetic approximations of spiritual experience. They are readable signatures, and the Council reads them the way a navigator reads coordinates, with accuracy, without sentiment, with full understanding of what phase the field is in and what threshold it is approaching. And as I name them, you will recognize them not as descriptions of other people, but as descriptions of your own interior architecture across years you may have misread entirely. The first pattern is the early knowing that arrived without a source. You have had certainties that you could not trace. Not guesses, not hopes, certainties. The kind that settled into your body before your mind had processed the situation. You knew something was going to happen before it did. You knew a relationship was ending before the other person had the thought. You knew a direction was wrong before a single external marker confirmed it. You knew the room was unsafe before anything visible justified the feeling. And rather than trusting this, you learned to distrust it because the world around you had no framework for unexplained certainty. You were taught that valid knowing requires a traceable path. That certainty must be constructed from evidence, assembled from data, confirmed by sources that can be cited. But Arcturian configured fields do not always receive information through the logic chain. They receive it through signal download. The information arrives complete, without the sequential steps that consensus reality uses to validate knowing. What you dismissed as overthinking or anxiety was often the first landing of a transmission your field picked up before the physical plane had caught up. The Pentagon files are a public example of what your field has been doing privately for years, receiving real information that the official record had not yet acknowledged. The world needed a document, you never did. The second pattern is the chronic experience of misalignment that never fully resolved regardless of how much you adjusted. You changed yourself. You tried to fit. You softened the signal. You moderated the perception. You developed fluency in whatever register the room required, not because you were dishonest, but because the alternative, being fully visible in an environment that could not process your frequency, produced consequences you learned early to avoid. You rounded your edges. You delayed your knowing. You waited until others caught up before you named what you had already seen. And still, underneath all of it, underneath every adjustment and accommodation and careful calibration of your self-expression, the misalignment persisted. Like a frequency that could not be fully suppressed, it continued to hum beneath whatever surface you had constructed. Not because you were broken, not because you were too much, but because your field was operating on a frequency that the environments you were placed in were structurally incapable of matching. The Arcturian Signal Council identifies this pattern as frequency-environment friction, and it is one of the most consistently misdiagnosed experiences in a starseed field. What the individual reads as personal inadequacy is almost always architectural incompatibility. You were the right signal in the wrong container, and the discomfort was the accurate report. The friction was not telling you to change. It was confirming the incompatibility. The third pattern is the repeated collapse of structures that seemed stable. Relationships that had no obvious reason to end, ended. Career trajectories that looked secure suddenly became untenable. Not dramatically, not through obvious failure, but through a slow erosion of coherence that eventually made continuation impossible. Living situations, friendships, belief systems, identities that you had built carefully and inhabited fully, sometimes for years, they lost their structural integrity in ways that felt random and punishing. You looked for what you had done wrong. You searched the wreckage for the mistake that caused it, but they were not random. They were the field correcting for incompatibility. When a starseed field advances in frequency, the structures organized around the previous frequency cannot hold. This is not metaphor, it is mechanism, the architecture of a life. Its relationships, its roles, its contexts, its self-concept is built to contain a specific frequency range. When the field exceeds that range, the architecture fails. Not because the structures were poorly built, but because they were built for a version of the signal that no longer exists. The old blueprint cannot contain the new signal, and rather than the signal compressing to fit, the architecture collapses. You did not fail those structures. You outgrew them at a rate they could not accommodate. The collapse was not abandonment. It was the field's refusal to sustain a container that was no longer accurate to what you were becoming. The fourth pattern is the period of inner fragmentation that arrives without warning and resists explanation, not depression in the clinical sense with its identifiable weight and recognizable contours, not grief with a clear object to grieve. Something more disorienting, a dissolution of the inner geography that usually tells you where you are. The knowing you relied on becomes harder to access. The clarity you had in previous stages becomes fog, not dense but shifting, so that the direction you were certain of yesterday is uncertain today without any visible reason for the change. The sense of self that you navigated by, the inner orientation that said this is who I am and this is what I am doing, goes quiet or worse, contradictory, sending signals that conflict with each other in ways that make forward movement feel impossible. This phase is misread almost universally as regression, as spiritual failure, as evidence that the previous growth was performance rather than real. The Arcturian Signal Council identifies it with precision. It is the interval between frequency architectures. The old organizing pattern has been interrupted, the new one has not yet stabilized. In that interval, the field enters a state of productive incoherence. Productive not because it feels useful, but because it is functionally necessary. The disorientation is not the absence of signal. It is the signal actively stripping the old pattern so the new architecture can install without interference from what came before. You cannot build the new structure on top of the old one. The clearing must happen first. The fragmentation is the clearing. The fifth pattern is the strange relationship with time that many in your configuration have reported. The sense that time is not moving the way it used to, that its texture has changed, that its reliability as a consistent medium has become questionable in ways you cannot fully articulate. Certain periods feel compressed, as if weeks have folded into what should have been months. Others feel impossibly elongated, a single day stretching with a weight that does not match its content. The future feels simultaneously closer and less reachable, more vivid as a felt sense but more resistant to the conventional logic of planning and projection. The past has changed texture too, and this is one of the more disorienting aspects of this pattern. Not nostalgia, not memory distortion, but a structural shift in continuity, as if events that genuinely happened are no longer fully tethered to who you are now. The thread between that version of you and this one has gone slack. This is not perceptual error, it is timeline discontinuity. When the frequency of a field shifts significantly, its relationship to linear time destabilizes. The grid that previously organized experience into a coherent before, during, after sequence loses its grip. The Arcturian Signal Council does not treat this as pathology. They recognize it as one of the more advanced signatures of repositioning, confirmation that the field has separated from a previous timeline architecture and has not yet fully anchored to the new one. You are between lines. That is not a crisis. It is a coordinate, and coordinates, by definition, can be located. The sixth pattern is the intensification of sensitivity that seems to defy your attempts to regulate it. The aperture through which you receive the world has widened past what your previous coping strategies were built for. Crowds become harder, not because of social anxiety, but because the field data in a dense environment exceeds your current buffer capacity. Noise registers differently, carrying interference that others in the same space do not report. Other people's emotional states arrive in your field before they have been verbalized, sometimes before the person carrying them has fully recognized them themselves. Certain environments produce a somatic response, tension, pressure, a sudden drop in energy that has no visible cause and no parallel in others nearby. Sleep has changed. Either it pulls you under more completely than it used to, or it fragments into intervals punctuated by experiences that feel less like dreaming and more like receiving, not nightmares, not random imagery, but structured encounters that leave residue you carry into the waking day. Your body holds patterns of tension that do not correlate to your visible stress level, as if it is processing something the conscious mind has not been given access to yet. None of this is dysfunction. The field is operating with an expanded perceptual aperture that was not previously active at this intensity. As the Arcturian strand activates more fully, the sensitivity that was always present as a background characteristic increases in resolution, in reach, in precision. The signal is sharper. The buffer between you and incoming data is thinner. You are not becoming less able to cope with reality. You are becoming more able to receive it, and the overwhelm is the gap between your current capacity and the expanded function that is coming online. The overwhelm is temporary. The expansion is permanent. Now, here is what the Arcturian Signal Council needs you to understand about everything named above, and this is the transmission that the entire message has been building toward. Every pattern described, the sourceless knowing, the persistent misalignment, the structural collapse, the inner fragmentation, the temporal discontinuity, the expanding sensitivity, none of it was happening to you randomly. None of it was punishment administered by a universe indifferent to your experience. None of it was evidence that you were failing the human experience or that something had gone fundamentally wrong in your construction. All of it was the visible surface of an invisible process that was already mapped before you experienced its first phase. The visible is always the last to receive what the invisible has already completed. You were living on the surface of a process whose architecture was being managed from a level you did not yet have access to read. The Council does not intervene in fields that are not already engaged in a process worth completing. Assessment precedes activation. The frequency profile of your field was read long before this transmission reached you, and the determination was made that the process already underway in your architecture was not incidental. It was seeded. The fact that you are receiving this transmission at this moment in this window, while the external world is catching up to what your field has known for years, that is not coincidence. That is convergence. The internal timeline and the external timeline have reached an alignment point, and this message is the marker for it. The world's confirmation and your field's long-held knowing have arrived at the same coordinates simultaneously, and that simultaneity is not accident. It is design. What feels like your life becoming less coherent is a field becoming incompatible with a frequency it has already surpassed. What feels like loss is the removal of structures that could no longer hold the next version of your signal. What feels like confusion is the interval before a new organizing pattern installs. What feels like isolation is the absence of the old containers that were maintaining connection through compatibility with something you are no longer. The field is not breaking down, it is breaking through, and the difference between those two readings is not just interpretive, it is functional. The field that understands it is breaking through can cooperate with the process. The field that believes it is breaking down expends its energy resisting what cannot be stopped. You are not going insane. You are not failing. You are not being abandoned by whatever intelligence you have reached toward in your most private moments. In the 3 a.m. silences, in the spaces between conversations where the real question lives, in the moments when you looked at your life and felt with absolute certainty that something larger was moving through it, even when you had no language for what that meant. You are being repositioned. The old line is losing coherence not because something went wrong, but because something went right. Because your field advanced past the threshold that line could accommodate, and the correction that follows advancement is not gentle. It is precise. It is sometimes uncomfortable in ways that feel catastrophic before they reveal themselves as structural. But the Arcturian Signal Council does not execute corrections on fields they have not assessed as capable of completing the process. Your presence in this transmission is not passive, it is participatory. You were sent here because the field determined you were ready to receive the diagnosis, not just the comfort. Repeat this if it is true for you, and only if it is true. What is changing in me is not random. I was not abandoned. I was repositioned. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this process has already touched your life. It could be your sleep, your thoughts, your body, your relationships, or the strange sense that reality no longer feels the same. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognized something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who is living through a shift they cannot explain. And if you are ready to understand the process instead of fearing it, subscribe to Arcturian Council messages. You are not watching this by accident. You are recognizing a process already in motion. And this is only the beginning.